Good afternoon and welcome to the second of 3 presentations in the ALCTS Annual 2012 Online Pre-Conference, Local Collections Collective Context, Managing Print Collections in the Age of Collaboration. I'm Jessica Phillips, host of today's pre-conference. Today's presentation is Shared Collection Management, Bibliographic Aspects, with Constance Malpas and Lizanne Payne. Constance Malpas is a program officer with OCLC Research and works with a team based in the San Francisco Bay Area. She manages a program of work examining the transition of scholarly work from print-based media to networked resources and the impact of this transition on the organization of academic libraries. Since 2007, she has led a research agenda exploring the policy and infrastructure requirements for shared print management, including detailed investigations of last copy preservation agreements, metadata standards for registration of shared print collections, and the role of mass digitization and print management strategies. Constance holds degrees from Mount Holyoke College and Princeton University, and has a special interest in the conceptual and social organization of scientific knowledge. She is a frequently invited speaker at national and international conferences on the future of academic libraries. Lizanne Payne is a consultant active in the field of shared print collections among academic libraries. Currently, she serves as the project manager for the Western Regional Storage Trust, a distributed retrospective journal repository system, and as a planning consultant for the RECAP Discovery to Delivery project, which aims to develop a shared collection for RECAP partners, New York Public Library, Columbia University, and Princeton University. She served as print archives consultant to the Center for Research Libraries, as a member of the planning team for the OCLC Print Archives Disclosure Pilot project, and as consultant to several other organizations, including the Committee on Institutional Cooperation. Ms. Payne has extensive experience in the field of library consortia, shared library systems, and library storage repositories. She served for 20 years as Executive Director of the Washington Research Library Consortium. She is a graduate of Smith College and earned an MLS from the University of Maryland and an MBA from the George Washington University. If you have questions for either of the presenters, please type them into the question box on your screen. Also, please note today's session will be recorded and you will receive an email with a link to the recording shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. A copy of the slides will also be provided. You are invited to use the Twitter hashtag SharedPrintMGT, which you can see on the slide, to interact with other participants during the webinar. However, please continue to submit questions for the presenters using the question box on the screen, as neither the presenters nor the host will monitor Twitter during the presentation. Please note that there may be a slight delay as I turn the presentation over to Constance.
Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon. It's really a delight to have this opportunity to share some information about work that OCLC has been engaged in over some years, very much in partnership with Lizanne Payne. So it's particularly a pleasure to be able to share the discussion today with Lizanne. We've been working together in this area for several years now. We've organized our session this afternoon in 2 parts. I'm going to start by providing some background on the strategy that OCLC has been working on with a number of library organizations in North America and elsewhere for supporting shared print management. Lizanne will then provide some detailed information about the implementation side of the strategy that we have been working on for this last while. Before I embark in the details of the strategy specifics, I did want to start by establishing a level set, if you will, just to remind us all that shared print is not just a buzzword or a trend. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't have any intrinsic value in itself. It's a response to a set of specific and increasingly acute challenges that face the library community today. First, and most obviously, we're faced with the ongoing transition from print to electronic formats for both scholarly communications and increasingly trade and leisure reading as well. And this transition has meant that legacy print inventory has lost some of its luster as an institutional asset. We are increasingly called upon to quantify its value in different terms. Secondly, particularly for many academic institutions, there's increasing pressure to reallocate library space for teaching and learning functions to reduce the footprint of low-use print collections at the center of campus. It was interesting for those of you who were able to attend yesterday's session to hear that the Michigan project was motivated not just by an interest in regaining library space, but a deep impulse amongst the partners there to engage in new forms of collaboration. For many institutions, it really is driven by a pragmatic concern about the need to repurpose library space. Critically, among university libraries in particular, there's a very deep concern about that the number of institutions that have a mission or mandate to preserve comprehensive print collections is shrinking. And this necessarily means that preservation responsibility must be distributed differently. Finally, there's the essential question of how libraries can sort out their respective roles for print preservation. It's increasingly common to hear information professionals, library directors, speaking of legacy prints as commodity collections that can and should be sourced from external providers, including collaborative solutions sourced from other libraries. This is, in effect, an extension of the kind of thinking that is driving many institutions to explore patron-driven acquisition on the front end. So this is essentially an approach to understanding how one might manage retrospective collections in a just-in-time manner. At present, it's not possible for libraries to effectively imagine externalizing some of those print management functions without some kind of undergirding infrastructure. And that's one of the reasons we believe that more systematic disclosure of print archiving strategies, print archiving commitments, is an essential part of the solution to this problem. Looking ahead, we believe that the provision of some undergirding infrastructure to support shared print management will become increasingly important. As yesterday's webinar made plain, I think institutions are increasingly driven to enter into shared print arrangements even without there being overmuch infrastructure. And it was very interesting to hear the descriptions yesterday of how that, the parameters for selection of materials and the need to establish retention commitments became clear over the course of the MySPI initiative. And I think, as yesterday's speakers also made plain, the kinds of shared print arrangements that are emerging today are not very much based on the dark archiving model, but instead assume that collections will continue to be made available for use. And this has important implications for the kind of infrastructure that will be needed. For example, we believe that there will be increasing need for support for interlending and resource sharing of these collections. These have obviously important implications for the kind of infrastructure that will be required. We believe that shared print management strategies increasingly for retrospective collections will be coextensive with strategies for acquisition and collection development. So again, this is not a solution to a marginal effort in the library enterprise, but instead a core operation. And finally, we think that print management strategies will increasingly need to be aligned with large-scale digital preservation initiatives. And this means that infrastructure that supports shared print archiving must be aligned with the practices that also support shared digital archives. Thinking about the implications that this has for the nature of the bibliographic infrastructure that may be required to support shared print, we believe that it will entail a focus, a shift in focus from cooperative management of title-level bibliographic data, which is essentially the modus operandi of WorldCat today, to management of more granular item-level metadata. This is important for a number of reasons laid out here. For preservation risk assessment, there's a deep concern about understanding the extent of existing inventory. How many copies are there? How many copies do we need to have? Yesterday there were some interesting questions about preservation assessment with respect to the condition of print archives. There's, as was acknowledged yesterday, there isn't right now an obvious place to record that information, so there's a concern about needing to provide some infrastructure for that. Thinking about the kind of operational side of managing shared print collections, there's a need for better information about which copies in particular can be retained, should be retained, how space recovery can be maximized. All of these require better control, better bibliographic control of item level metadata than has been available to date. And finally, but critically important, many of the business models that are emerging around shared print and shared digital rely on value calculations that are based on item level metadata. So thinking from an OCLC perspective, there was both a conviction that WorldCat provides a kind of obvious piece of core infrastructure upon which to build, but also an acknowledgement, I think, that the title level metadata management schemes that we have in place might not be a perfect fit for emerging requirements for shared print. In a nutshell, we contend that the infrastructure for shared print collections requires support for both sides of the equation, for suppliers, that is those who will archive print, and also for consumers, the libraries that we anticipate will be transacting with the shared print suppliers. So in thinking about infrastructure requirements, we were trying to be sensitive to both of these dimensions. From the print archiving supplier side, clearly there was a need for a mechanism to enable registration and disclosure of the archiving commitments at a title and volume level, a mechanism for integrating some of that item level metadata into decision support tools to identify and select material to be archived. From the consumer side, there are related needs for identifying resources that are already held that might be suitable for withdrawal or suitable for contribution to a shared print archive. So both of these dimensions were important to us in considering what kind of infrastructure requirements we would need to be responsive to. Shared print, as I mentioned at the outset, has been an area of activity within OCLC research for some time now, for several years, since 2007 in particular. I won't go through these initiatives in detail, but I did want to acknowledge that this work has built upon years of effort, starting from a serious examination that Lizanne did for us, assessing the existing storage infrastructure in North America, to an effort that examined policy requirements and identified a critical gap in existing infrastructure, which was support for disclosure of print archiving commitments. That then extended into some work examining the need for, as I say, copy level, not just title level, but copy, volume level retention and condition statements. And that later led to some work examining integration with digital archiving systems. So it's a long program of work, and each year has added to our understanding of the kind of infrastructure requirements that we believe OCLC should be addressing. Starting in 2010, print archiving activities at OCLC began to move from the OCLC research interest into the product management group. A lot of this had to do with the development of the World Share Management Services portfolio, a lot of internal investigations into where OCLC might be most supportive of some of these shared print management efforts. So in 2010, there was a joint effort with product management to establish a pilot project that would specifically look at opportunities to leverage the existing investment in WorldCat, so build on existing bibliographic infrastructure, and specifically to take that past work that research had undertaken looking at use of the MARC 583 Preservation Action Note to extend it into local holdings. This was the mandate of the Shared Print Archives Disclosure Pilot Project, specifically to look at how use of the 583 Action Note could be extended to the local holdings detailed records for registration of print archiving commitments. The 583 Action Note will be familiar to some, perhaps all of you, given the nature of the audience here, everyone interested in print archiving. The 583 Action Note was of interest to us from the outset because it's defined for use both in the bibliographic and in the local holdings record. So remembering that we started from a presumption that you would be working from WorldCat, we were trying to understand, identify tools that would lend themselves to extension from a title level metadata management scheme into item level holdings. The 583 had already been successfully deployed for cooperative microfilming projects back in the early 90s, mid-90s, extended to web archiving for a couple of institutions, and most importantly had been quite successfully deployed in a joint effort with the Digital Library Federation and OCLC in the build-out of the Registry of Digital Masters. I'll have a little bit more to say about that in just a moment. And additionally, partly as a result of the work that went into the Registry of Digital Masters, there's an extensive existing preservation and digitization action thesaurus that has already been defined that provides controlled vocabularies, some of which terms were appropriate for extension to print archiving action. So again, the MARC 583 represented a piece of existing bibliographic infrastructure that seemed to be fit to purpose for use in print archiving efforts. There were a couple of specific pieces of the 583 Action Note. Lizanne will have more to say about this in a moment. That seemed particularly important for print archiving. So there's the ability to record information about the specific action that's undertaken. So for print archiving purposes, we considered that would be an appropriate place to register the commitment to retain or condition information, which has been largely lacking in these kinds of efforts to date. There are tags as subfields that are defined for uses that really seemed a very good fit for print archiving. So the ability to unambiguously identify the program under which materials were archived, the specifics of the condition of an individual item, specifics about validation. So right down the line, the 583 seemed to offer a lot of the granular control of metadata about print archiving that seemed worthy of investigation. An important consideration for us, as I say, since we were looking to extend existing bibliographic infrastructure, was the degree to which the 583 Action Note was already in use in WorldCat. Looking at WorldCat today, based on the most recent research snapshot that enables us to run some of these calculations, we're looking at about 5.8 million bibliographic, that is master level, records in WorldCat that contain 583 data. So a pretty substantial existing data set that told us something about the way libraries are already using the 583 Action Note. The vast majority of these are for monographic titles. That was a red flag to us in thinking about infrastructure for journal-based print archiving efforts. Very importantly, as we look at implementation of the 583 Action Note in WorldCat, so that is the existing workflows that are resulting in 583 data making their way into WorldCat, very few of those include the subfield 3, which is used for specifying the materials that have been subjected to the preservation action. So thinking back to the remark I made a little bit earlier, the absence of specificity about the materials that have been subjected, in this case, to print archiving commitment, was a matter of serious concern to us. One could say globally that based on present implementation in WorldCat at the bibliographic level, that is at the title level, the 583 seemed ill-suited to registration at the item level of cooperative preservation commitments. And further, for serial holdings in particular, which was the particular focus of the print disclosure pilot project, there was a recognition that we needed to provide a greater specificity about the extent of the local holdings that were going to be subject to print archiving. So 583 both appealing because it provided a lot of the core infrastructure requirements, but slightly deficient from our perspective. One of the ways in which 583 data is most present now in the WorldCat environment is in the Registry of Digital Masters, which is in effect simply a subset of bibliographic records within WorldCat as a whole. As of today, or quite recently, the Registry of Digital Masters includes over 5 million title-level digital preservation commitments, so a suggestion that the 583 has been successfully implemented here. The majority of those records represent titles in the Hathi Trust. Some of you may recall that not so very many years ago, in fact I think as recently as 2008, the Registry of Digital Masters included only about 2,000 titles. So there's been a huge increase in the last few years in registration of digital masters in WorldCat that had everything to do with mass digitization and the desirability of more effectively disclosing the digital archiving commitments that were coming through Hathi Trust. So again, some takeaways for us from examining use of the Registry of Digital Masters. It wasn't until we had mass digitization and the need to record a large volume of digital archiving information that we began to see the ramp up in the Registry of Digital Masters. An important aspect of the growth of the Registry of Digital Masters, I should also acknowledge, has been that some of the production of those records is now centralized. It's automated. It's a process that's run by OCLC. And that also told us something about the need for automating as much of the workflows for creation of archiving information as possible. Just briefly, I wanted to look at a couple of examples here to give you a sense of how these 583 statements are embedded in the existing infrastructure. So here we're looking at a screenshot in connection of a title from the Registry of Digital Masters. And there's a 583 tag visible here. I've expanded it to make it a little bit more legible. A 583 statement that was contributed by the University of Chicago. This is a 583 statement that's part of a bibliographic record describing a print book. A print book that's held by 169 libraries. Chicago digitized it, and they're registering with this 583 a commitment to preserve the digital surrogate. So very helpful, essential information for a lot of institutions making decisions about what to digitize, but also there's a certain amount of cognitive dissonance going on here. We're looking at a bibliographic description of a print book against which a digital preservation commitment has been registered. Another way in which 583 preservation action notes are appearing in WorldCat, and one that was particularly of interest to us in the context of print archiving, is the small number of bibliographic records containing 583 action notes for print retention through the UK Research Reserve. This is a major initiative in the United Kingdom to build a distributed print archiving system. A small number of the institutions that are participating in that effort have been contributing their retained title records to WorldCat, and partly inspired by the work that had been done over the past few years looking at the 583, they opted to use the 583 to note the retention statement. Here you can see it's a very brief use of the 583, simply acknowledging that this specific title has been retained. Important to note that here, because the 583 has not been universally adopted as a common mechanism for recording this kind of information, this particular commitment is being registered by St. Andrew's University Library in Scotland. But there's nothing in this 583 note that would tell you that. We know that because we can look under the hood and see from whence it came. So interestingly, we have evidence that the 583 is being used at the bibliographic master level, but some question about whether or not it's serving the purpose that we need for building print archiving strategies at scale. simply to remind everybody of the importance of the item level information here. So we've just been looking at some examples of use of the 583 action note in the bibliographic record. Those are encouraging. They've taught us a lot about what's possible. However, as I mentioned previously, there's a lot of concern, particularly for serial archiving, but it's also been raised in the context of monographic print archiving, that we need to be able to provide more granular information about the extent of the resource that has actually been subjected to archiving. I think it goes without saying that in distributed archiving of journal collections, it's critically important that there be full, transparent disclosure of which volumes in a serial run are actually subject to a print archiving retention commitment. Essential for distributed archiving, as I say here, since you may have institutions individually contributing different segments of an individual print journal run. So again, examining the existing infrastructure in WorldCat, if we look at local holdings records, that is the item level records, not traditionally a part of WorldCat. It's only in the last several years that we've seen increasing support for local holdings in WorldCat. Pretty substantial today. We're looking at almost 33 million detailed holdings records in WorldCat as of very recent statistics. Contributions from many thousands of libraries. Important, though, to note that almost 40% of the holdings statements that are contributed, these detailed item-level holding statements, come from only 85 ARL institutions. So we're looking at a significant part of the contribution of local holdings information coming from the exact population that is most likely to be engaged in print archiving activities. So again, this suggested to us that some combination of implementation at the local holdings record and the 583 would be a natural extension of workflows that are already built into institutions that are contributing data to WorldCat. All of this on the premise that it's preferable from our perspective to build on existing workflows and established practices rather than trying to start something from scratch and provide disruption in existing workflows. Simply a graphic to demonstrate the relatively rapid growth of local holdings records in WorldCat. This gives us some confidence that we're going to see more and more of these appearing. So as a natural infrastructure upon which to build, it seems to lend itself to extension into print archiving. So in the print archiving pilot, which began in rough form in 2010, but was really most active in 2011 and the first part of this year, we worked with 8 libraries that were already actively engaged in large-scale print archiving efforts to specifically test this application of the 583 action note to the local holdings record. I've listed the participating institutions here. We were quite selective about the institutions that participated in the pilot. We only wanted to work with institutions that had that were already engaged in print archiving. So in other words, they already had some title data to supply and could be relied upon to not get tied up in the how do we select titles, but actually have data that would be ready for manipulation. So the Center for Research Libraries JSTOR archive was a natural fit. The Western Regional Storage Trust effort, in which Lizanne has been a major player, was another critical part of the pilot, providing several institutions that contributed data and helped to establish the metadata guidelines. The CIC Shared Print Initiative, Indiana University being the hub of that effort, was also a participant, and the University of Minnesota also participated to explore application of this model to a dark JSTOR archive. I'm not going to run in detail through the activities of the pilot itself. We spent a lot of work collectively establishing some metadata guidelines for use of the 583 in the local holdings record. This extended some of the controlled vocabulary that had already been established for the PDA. We had some really terrific working groups that helped establish these new controlled term lists. There was extensive work by the partner institutions to test mechanisms for creating and contributing LHRs, both in real time through the OCLC connection browser, and then also as part of regular batch loading activities. Both of those needed to be tested for ensuring that if institutions created this data, that we could actually harness it within WorldCat. there was some testing of the impact of these registration activities on resource sharing workflows. And then finally, of course, the most important piece was to document all of the work and to identify roadblocks for implementation at the institutional level. So what we learned about the difficulties of creating these 583 action statements for print archiving at individual institutions, and then also, very importantly from OCLC's perspective, to understand where we hit roadblocks internally for operationalizing some of the support within OCLC. The final report came out in April. We recently blogged a little bit about the project and provided a link to the report there. The report has all of what you might expect it to include, a summary of the activities that were undertaken. The specifics of the metadata guidelines that Lizanne will be outlining provide some sample data, implementation guidelines, and very importantly, both recommendations for print archiving institutions and some internal recommendations for OCLC. Lizanne is going to speak about the specifics of the implementation of the strategy that we tested in the Print Archives Disclosure Pilot. There are a couple of main components. I'll touch very briefly on them in the first instance. In order to support these critical workflows within existing WorldCat services, it is necessary to establish new print archiving institution symbols. Those are particularly important for resource discovery and resource sharing. Clearly critically important that institutions contribute the actual local holdings records containing 583 tag data. So it was very important to establish those best practices, the metadata guidelines. Also some recommendations for how to best support discovery and resource sharing for the disclosed print archiving commitments. Worth noting that this project was specifically focused on registration of print archiving commitments for serial titles, not for monographs. In principle, we believe the model is extensible to monographs, but we haven't tested that. That's something we're interested in doing looking forward. I wanted to close with a couple of examples of, well, one example really, of how this registration activity is now being presented within WorldCat. So this, as you see, is it's a screenshot from First Search for a fairly widely held journal held by over 1,000 libraries. Because, as I say, we've seen a ramp up in contribution of local holdings data from many institutions, we have hundreds and hundreds of local holdings for this specific journal. So we have it from any number of institutions. One of the local holdings that has been contributed as part of the pilot is this one. This is a local holdings record that was contributed by the University of California at San Diego. You can see highlighted there in yellow part of the 583 preservation action statement expressing their commitment to retain this item. So one can imagine for titles like this that are very widely held, the registration by one institution, one local holdings record from among hundreds of thousands of libraries that actually hold this title has the capacity to fundamentally change the way other institutions manage their collections. This is the solution we're looking for. This is the registration and disclosure of a print archiving commitment that we believe can fundamentally transform library operations across the board. Again, just foreshadowing some of the detail that Lizanne will provide. Fundamentally, the recommendations for print archiving come down to a contribution from institutions that are engaged in print archiving efforts independently or cooperatively to begin to contribute detailed local holdings record to WorldCat and other union catalogs, including 583 action notes that specify the retention commitment and follow, to the extent possible, the guidelines that we have outlined. I should acknowledge that, particularly given the uncertainties about the extension of the existing model to serial titles, we acknowledge that there will be institutions that are likely to contribute this data at the master record level, that is, in the bibliographic record rather than in the LHR. Our preference is to see this data in the local holdings record. However, if it's present in the 583 in the bibliographic record, it can still contribute enormous value in terms of disclosing print retention statements. We have made good progress since the start of the project. We now have 32 new print archiving symbols in WorldCat. In other words, these are symbols you could use in searching to identify archived titles in WorldCat. You see a few of them noted here. They're easy to find in the WorldCat registry. Just look for shared print. Within WorldCat itself, we have, as noted here, more than 2,800 titles now with print archiving commitments in WorldCat. That's, of course, a small part of the world's journal literature, but it's a not insubstantial start to print archiving registration information in WorldCat, and this is entirely to the credit of the institutions that participated in the print archiving pilot. It's their hard work that has resulted in the registration of these resources. Worth knowing for those of you who do a lot of work in connection, you can use, because we have started indexing the 583 tag data at the local holdings level in connection, you can use the same index labels for the action note to retrieve titles that include retention statements. So simply here a screenshot of a test record, a test query of that nature using the committed to retain action statement in combination with a small number of print archiving institution codes, and you can see here that it retrieves over 1,300 individual title records for print archived journals. What's next? We're developing a frequently asked questions document to make clear the level of print archiving support that's currently available at OCLC. That should be published on the web quite soon. I've seen a recent, very near final draft of that. It'll include instructions on how to request and get set up the new shared print symbol, the specifics on how to request batch loading LHR with print archiving information, clearly better access to the metadata guidelines, and some information on implications for resource sharing. And we do anticipate in the coming months that we'll be engaged in some further exploration of how extensible this model is for monographic print archiving, since we now feel relatively confident that where needed for journal archiving efforts, this strategy is workable. We're quite interested to push that out to see how it might be usefully extended to the monographic literature. And with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions. I haven't seen any come in over the course of the presentation, and it may be that you haven't questions at present, and we can hold them all till after Lizanne's. But I'll pause for just a moment here in case there are individuals that choose to pose some questions now. Not seeing any, I will propose that perhaps we use our poll. Lizanne and I thought we'd take advantage of the transition from my high-level strategy background on the print archives disclosure pilot to ask all of you what you feel about your likely adoption of print archiving disclosure strategy. So we're curious to know how likely you think it is that you will contribute print archiving commitments to WorldCat or to any other union catalog using any mechanism. Obviously, we'd be interested to know if you plan to follow the guidelines that we've set forward, but expressions of interest in print archiving disclosure would be most welcome. Well, isn't this fun to see it ticking along? So, the very likely are in the front with some somewhat likely. Would be interesting, perhaps. Now, as I say, I haven't gone into the full details of implementation of this particular strategy, knowing that clearly the vast majority of you feel that there's some likelihood high likelihood that you would be disclosing print archiving statements. Perhaps after Lizanne has had an opportunity to expose to you some of the detailed implementation guidelines, we'll get a sense of whether or not those numbers still hold at the close of this presentation. And now I think we might pass the controls to Lizanne. I guess there are a few questions. Oh, sorry, yes. So, how long does one commit to preserve? Well, very good question. That is at the discretion of the archiving program. So if you participated in yesterday's session, you'll know that the Michigan group had lengthy discussions, I gather, about the length of their retention commitment that those institutions would be upholding, and I think they finally concluded that they would use a term of 15 years for the Western Regional Storage Trust. I believe they've set 2035 as the time period at which registration commitments would be reassessed. In the UK, they have a much shorter retention period, so there isn't any set period of time. It's entirely at the discretion of the institution, and one can register that in the 583. Another question, is there a timeline for the development of use of the 583 for archiving monographs? A good question. There isn't a specific timeline. Lizanne and I are both engaged in some discussions with a very interesting project in Maine that's specifically focused on monographic archiving, and there's been some thought to organizing some focused discussion with the institutions in Maine and in Michigan and elsewhere that are actively engaged in monographic archiving. I will say that at the outset we were focused on serials because that's where the interest was. We're interested in monographic archiving, but in the absence of institutions that actually have active monographic archiving efforts, it was impossible to establish a timeline. A further question, why guidelines and not requirements? A very sensible question. Well, the short answer is because we cannot enforce any requirement. At best, we can put forward a guideline, and so if you imagine the guidelines for the Registry of Digital Masters are guidelines, they're not requirements, much as implementation of much of the rulemaking in both bibliographic description and in local holdings is a matter of social convention. There's not a law that we can pass. We can strongly encourage institutions to uphold a certain set of practices, but we're simply not in a position to be able to enforce them as requirements. Question about who will be involved in investigating the extension to monographic archiving. That's still to be determined, to be perfectly candid. We know that the University of California has been active in their shared print program in establishing shared monographic collections. And now that we have some other groups of institutions that are actively involved in archiving books, we'll be looking to those institutions as the places to explore whether or not the guidelines that we've established are fully extensible. And by my note, that looks to be the final question for. Oh, here's a further question. Will OCLC product development be involved? I imagine that's a question specific to the extension to monographic archiving. It is certainly our intent that product management would be involved in the extension to monographs. Not least because for the monographic literature, as Rick Lugg mentioned yesterday, that's really where we have the best bibliographic control already. So from a product management standpoint, it's a little bit closer to where the rubber meets the road. And with that, I think I will take my leave and hand the controls to Lizanne, who actually already has the controls, and she can take it from here.
Thank you, Constance. I'm very happy to be talking with everybody this afternoon and following Constance's very nice overview of the sort of conceptual framework for shared print and how this all fits in. I'm going to be talking at a more detailed technical level, so for those of you who might have been dying to get to the tags and subfields level, we're getting there very soon. I do want to just recap only very briefly the whole project that Constance and I are talking about was a was a sort of a natural and ad hoc affiliation of interested parties. There was lots of support from OCLC, but it was not specifically an OCLC-sponsored effort. Several of us who've been involved in shared print and print archiving got together and spent this year or so trying to work out a process by which we could elaborate to libraries how they could best record information about shared print agreements that they were already making so that these would be revealed in WorldCat and available to OCLC resource sharing capabilities. One thing that's really important to keep in mind is that a primary goal of this disclosure pilot project, which was the genesis of the Metadata Guidelines, was to work out a de facto metadata standard specifically for journals, as Constance has already mentioned, using existing capabilities at OCLC and ideally within local ILS systems. And this is a quote from the final report of the project. What we were very explicitly trying to do was to outline some instructions and recommendations and guidelines for libraries so that they could begin immediately or on whatever timetable met their needs to record this information without waiting for any software development on OCLC's part to support it. In other words, just use existing metadata fields and support processes to begin to disclose this information as soon as possible. You will see as we talk through some of these things, you might have in the back of your mind, well, there might have been a better way to do that, and we fully understand that that's the case. And we hope to be laying out to OCLC product development some better ways to do it, and we have outlined some of those in the final report. But it's a key concept of this set of metadata guidelines that we were using existing MARC and OCLC WorldCat capabilities that everybody already had access to. I also want to re-emphasize what Constance said, that these guidelines were developed in the context of journals and not specifically envisioned or tested for monographs. We do think they are likely to work in most or all cases, but we didn't test them for monographs, and we're hoping to gather a similar kind of ad hoc group of interested parties to test them in the monograph arena. We already have some idea that there are some functions where it will not work as well for monographs as it does for journals because of existing OCLC functionality that may vary for monographs. Okay, here's where we start getting into the technical details. The print archiving metadata guidelines basically establish a three-part data structure that we ask libraries to follow. One is that libraries that are maintaining the materials in a print archive, that are the holding institutions, would define a separate OCLC institution symbol for the library or the storage facility or whatever location in the library in that organization is holding the shared print materials. The second thing is we're asking libraries to create MARC holdings records, local holdings records in the OCLC context for each title for which they have introduced a retention commitment. And third, within those local holdings records, we ask that you add 583 preservation action notes to describe the specifics of the print archiving or shared print collection activity that has been established for those sets of holdings. And I'm going to talk about each of these in quite some detail. Why the need for a separate OCLC institution symbol? The the main reasons are that, keeping in mind that contextual premise that I said earlier, that the goal was to add holdings to WorldCat in a way that would be usable by existing WorldCat system capabilities. Many things in the OCLC systems and database suite relies on institution symbol to govern the functionality of that particular application, like resource sharing, like collection analysis, like group catalogs for discovery. Those are all, the functioning of those applications and features are all built upon and dependent on institution symbols. The way it works in the context of shared print activity is that the way to look at it is that the new institution symbol attached to these titles indicates that this title is subject to a retention commitment at that institution. So the institution symbol in this context conveys a status as well as a location. The most specific reason for needing a new institution symbol has to do with resource sharing. It allows the various OCLC resource sharing functions to support different lending behaviors for shared print or print archives materials compared to the similar materials in the same location that are not subject to a retention agreement. And it's important to keep in mind that in many shared print, I would dare say most or all shared print agreements, the materials under a shared print agreement are a subset of the volumes in the same location, even if they're in a storage facility. The storage facility is likely to have a lot of volumes that are housed there that are not subject to a shared print agreement. So for purposes of lending, it's important to be able, for the systems, to be able to say this particular volume that came from this shelf behaves like a shared print item, even though the volume right next to it on the shelf does not. And given the way OCLC resource sharing works on all of its permutations, it's the institution symbol that accomplishes that. So we were aware all throughout the Print Archives pilot project that that establishing a new institution symbol was viewed as somewhat problematic and carries with it some noticeable workflow issues, but it was the least bad alternative we could come up with. These are examples of some shared print symbols that were assigned during the pilot project. This sort of goes along with the screen that Constance showed earlier about the 38 new symbols. Most of these are from the West project. A couple of them are not. The CRL Print Journal Archive is, of course, CRL, and the IULSP one is the Indiana University CIC Shared Print Repository. We suggested a naming convention for these so that they would sort of visually convey that it's a shared print program, but that's that's not mandatory, and in some cases can't even be accommodated if that combination of letters already denotes a different institution. Here's the key stuff. The metadata guidelines for shared print recommend defining a local holdings record for each shared print title, and these are the fields that it needs to contain. The first three here, the OCLC number and the leader directory fields and the location, are required by OCLC, and this is a technical requirement of the that relates specifically to the LHR batch load. The files will not load correctly if those fields are missing, so that's why I put in a separate column for required by OCLC. These fields are all needed for shared print, and when I say required in this column, in the fourth column at the right, I mean required for the shared print disclosure to have any meaning. They are not literally required in the sense that there's any enforcement of their presence, but these are the ones you need to have in order to accomplish the desired purpose of disclosing them in the first place. So the additional informational fields after the first three are fields to define the holdings that are covered by the retention agreement, either in the form of 85X, 86X holdings or a summary holding statement. The 583 action note, which is the single most important field that I'll talk about in detail also. And if possible, the ISSN, which supports linking to other, a match point for other data sets, and the 561 ownership and custodial history, which is a place to indicate the previous owner. And this is more detail about those, a couple of those fields. In the location field, and this is all within the context of the LHR, ideally. In the location field, the 852 dagger A subfield, the location would be the new shared print institution symbol, the institution symbol that's been defined to identify the shared print status for this institution. The 852 dagger B sublocation can be another sublocation or collection holding library code if you so desire. The holdings information, we need for you to disclose the holdings that are covered by the agreement. It may be all of them, it may be a subset of them if you don't have a complete run. And again, keeping in mind this was all in the context of journals, or serials rather. Because this piece of the local holding record identifies to other interested libraries which of the components of that journal or serial you have placed under a retention agreement at the given shared print location symbol. This third bullet point here about for institutions that already provide LHRs to OCLC, this is another quote from the final report. We wanted to spell out that in many cases the designation of material as belonging under a shared print agreement is a change from a previous WorldCat description. In some cases it's not. In some cases the material has only been described at the LHR level as part of the shared print activity, in which case this statement would not apply. But if it had been previously listed in WorldCat with an LHR and subsequently is put under a retention agreement, the goal would be to edit the original one to remove that material from the original holding symbol so that the material is only reflected under one place. These are the desirable but not mandatory ones that I mentioned before. The ISSN, if it has one, is useful because it provides a match point to support collection analysis in comparison to other data sources. Like it might facilitate matching it to a Portico list or a JSTOR list or something like that. The 561 tag is useful to enter a description of the previous owner or multiple owners, multiple previous owners who contributed volumes to this shared print retained material. This is sometimes useful for documenting Section 108 compliance, for instance, to prove that you formerly owned it, and maybe this shared print arrangement is considered part of providing that material in in case of loss or damage of the original one. It's also useful in various kinds of shared print collection analysis to be able to track back who provided that material in the first place, so that you can know not to ask that library for that material again because they did already provide it. The 583 action note is the single most important field for disclosing information about the shared print material. And as Constance already mentioned earlier, it includes in structured subfields information about what shared print program it's a part of, what the retention period is, what the validation or review was done, if any was done. We came up with a recommended structure to provide a place to indicate the retention information and the validation or review information in a combination of separate 583 action notes. So what we're suggesting is that you create at least one, and maybe two, and maybe three 583s as appropriate to the processing that you did for those materials. So for all archived titles, you would create one 583 tag with a $A action field containing the phrase committed to retain. This would be the minimum needed to identify shared print materials and disclose them to the outside world through WorldCat. You could stop there, and I'll show you the specific minimum set of subfields for that 583, but you could stop there and have done a huge boon to the library community to reveal that retention commitment in that way. It also is possible in some cases to create this minimally required 583 in a batch mode, and without editing each record individually. We've had a couple of cases in the West project where they were able to do that. It depends a lot on the capabilities of your ILS and so forth, but part of the goal was to try to define a minimum set that could be created as simply as possible. So that's the number one 583. That's the minimally required one. If you do a review of the holdings for completeness of the run, and again keep in mind this is journals that we were initially talking about, we ask that you create a second 583 which has a different action field, a 583 $A action field. In this case would say completeness reviewed, meaning the completeness of the run was reviewed, and that you also report any identified gaps. Similarly, if you reviewed this material in terms of its condition, we would ask that you include another 583 with an action statement saying condition reviewed, and record the conditions that you found. And I'm going to show you the details there. This is the contents of the minimally required 583 action note for the minimal retention one, the one that says committed to retain. There would be these four subfields are the most important ones. The action one itself has this exact phrase, committed to retain. The $C has the field called time and date of action, which includes the date the commitment was made. This particular one has an established format YYY, year, month, day format. And this is just to indicate, basically when your decision was made. It can be, one generic date, or the date that the 583 was created, or whatever you want to put in there. The $D subfield is called the action interval, and for print archiving, we want that to contain the date the commitment expires, so that, as you'll see on a later example, in the West program, we decided to establish a single expiration date 25 years from the beginning of the program, so the West records are supposed to all have December 31st, 2035 in there. This is both in MARC terms and actual practice terms. This is a free text field. It doesn't have even the minimal year, month, day specification that this one does, but it would be useful to do that in a consistent way, at least within one program. The $F subfield, which is called authorization in the MARC definition of the 583, is where we ask you to identify the archiving program through which this material is committed to retain. So in a way, it means sort of what program is authorizing this action or governing this action. So here's where you would put in West or CRL JSTOR or CIC SPR or some consistently named description of the program that governs this material. In addition to those fundamental fields, there are some additional fields in the 583 action note that are useful for print archiving. The $J site of action, that can be a holdings location code, that has meaning within your library if for some reason it's different than the 852 location. In many cases, this would be a more detailed level of specificity. One that's useful especially to other libraries is to put in here in the $U, the Uniform Resource Identifier, a link to the documentation that describes this program. The idea was to have a way to link out to find out more about the terms and conditions that define this program. Similarly, there is the $3 subfield means the materials that to which this 583 specifically applies. If they're different than the holdings that were given at the LHR level, the 85X, 86X, or the 866 summary holding statement. The idea here is that you might, this applies more likely on the condition reviewed and completeness and condition reviewed fields of 583s, because you might have the case where an overall section of the run was being committed to retain, but a smaller subset was actually reviewed for condition. The $5 subfield is a place to record the MARC organization code, if you have one, to identify the archiving institution, which applies to various kinds of searches and applications in OCLC. The shared print locations may not necessarily have a MARC organization code. For instance, a shared storage facility that has its own OCLC symbol may not have an org code. It's more likely that the university itself has an org code. So that's it's a place to put the org code if you have one. This is an example of a retention-only record. If you look here at this 583, this is an example of a West item that has a committed to retain 583. The $C is the date the action was taken. This was just an arbitrary date indicating the beginning of 2011. $D is the retention period for the West items. It's through December 31st, 2035, as I mentioned. The $F, in this particular case, this item, which is from Oregon, the University of Oregon, is subject to multiple retention agreements, and that happens from time to time. And if the retention agreements have pretty much the same parameters in terms of retention period and so forth, it's perfectly okay to list all of the governing programs in one 583. So you can see here there's this particular title is subject to the Orbis Cascade Alliance Distributed Print Repository, OCA-DPR. It's part of West. It's actually part of the West Bronze subcategory. And the $J is the location. The $U is the URL for the, in this case it's the West information, links out to the West website. For the completeness review, this would be the second 583 in this particular set of examples. These are the fields that are most critical. Again, the A subfield, the action note, in this case it would be completeness reviewed, the date it was completed, the archiving program. For the validation level, we ask that you also fill in the $I method of action field, which indicates the level of review that was done. In the West program, we call that validation. It could be called review level, but the idea is to indicate to other people that this was reviewed at the volume level, or at the issue level, or at the page level, or not at all. You could put, but if it's not reviewed at all, you don't need this note at all. If you've done the completeness review, we ask you to include pairs of information in the status field and the public note to identify any completeness problems that you found. For example, put in the status field the word missing. There were reprints, binding patterns vary, and then in the associated public note specify what the problem was. So for example, you'd have a $Z public note that said missing volume 13, 1937. The idea would be to use multiple sets of pairs of $L, $Z pairs to record different statuses that you found, because you could of course find some things that were missing and some things that were reprints all in the same run. There's a question that I'm trying to read. The question is, and I will take the opportunity to answer it now, and feel free to ask questions in the question box, and I'll try to answer them as I can, or I might say for this particular one. I'll come back to it. This particular one I want to answer because it's relevant to the stage of what we're talking about. She says, how to identify how many institutions are committed to retain a title? Is there a limit to the number of 583s? It's important to understand that these 583s are all within the context of a single institution's local holdings record. So there are different 583s. There are different local holdings records attached to the master bib record, and maybe we'll come back at the end to look at one of Constance's slides which illustrated this better. But the point I want to make here is that there wouldn't be a zillion 583s within this one LHR for different locations. This is all within the context of one location. On the 583 action note for completeness reviewed, if you did not do any validation for completeness, you don't need this 583 at all. Same thing for if you reviewed them for condition. And keep in mind these kinds of reviews are completely optional, and they are required or not required within the context of individual shared print programs. The program is who makes the decision as to how much of this gets done and what the review constitutes. But if the program specifies that this be done, this is how you would report it. The condition reviewed 583 is very similar to the completeness reviewed one. It's just that the details about what kinds of problems are found would be different, and there is a PDA appendix that's included in the shared print disclosure final report that lists some condition problems that apply to shared print. And again, if you didn't do this kind of review, no problem at all. Just you don't need this 583 at all. This is an example of a record from Stanford who did a completeness and condition review for a West Gold title, and this gives you an idea of that it can get pretty complex. The first red outlined one is the completeness reviewed statement, and in the middle here it says missing volumes, then missing volumes 1 through 8, and then it says missing issue, missing volume 16, number 2. The West program for gold titles specifies completeness and condition review down to the issue level. So that's why they reviewed it in this way and reported it in this way. In the second group outlined in red, this is the condition reviewed statement, and you can see when it gets to the $L, $Z pairs, they found some cases of acidic paper. They found loose pages and recorded them. They found loose covers. The important thing to say here is that we were in the context of the metadata guidelines, we were trying to provide a mechanism for reporting this information, but it's entirely up to the print archiving program and the libraries participating in this to determine what level of effort is needed and valid for what kinds of materials, because clearly you can see by this record that it's a lot of effort to record this level of detail, but it provides important preservation information about this title, about this particular copy of this title. Okay, that was all about the local holding records and the 583s. Outside of the local holding record, we were suggesting that libraries that are part of a shared print agreement could choose to establish a group access capability profile for the program, which enables various kinds of searching. So you could search within the context of that program to find materials that are specifically affiliated with that program. You can sort of accomplish that through by looking at the individual holding locations, holding institution symbols, but at present the indexing of the 583 does not currently index the $F program statement, so there isn't any easy way with current OCLC capabilities. As I mentioned up front, there isn't any easy way to search by program from what's indexed in the 583. The group access capability would facilitate that. Similarly, if the program wished to, you could create a group catalog, which is a publicly searchable way to search the holdings in effect of that program. It would create a virtual catalog in effect. It lets not only staff who have access to connection, but also end users to search it if you wish that. It's not necessarily a given that you want a public view of the shared print collection, but individual programs might, and they could accomplish that through the group catalog. There are some specific steps that you need to undertake, and as Constance mentioned, we're hoping to have OCLC put up an FAQ about how to go about this, but basically you need to establish a new symbol to set up, to be able to enter the LHR metadata either through connection browser or through batch loading. If you're going to be lending from this shared print collection, and most of them are, you need to set up the lending parameters for that new symbol in the policies directory and make sure it's set to a supplier and not a non-supplier, and make sure that the shared print symbols are proliferated to your various custom holding groups and paths that that you might want. And lastly, for discovery, as I just mentioned, setting up a group access capability or a group catalog. There are some costs associated with doing this. While there's not necessarily a specific charge for defining new OCLC symbols, you may incur charges for doing cataloging under a new symbol, which kind of amounts to the same thing. If you're going to start doing LHR batch loading, there's a few $100, somewhere around $500 maybe, fee for setting up a new batch loading process. If you're an Iliad user, this is probably the single biggest cost. If you're an Iliad user and you want to support lending of this material through Iliad, there's a satellite library fee of about $1,200 per year. We're talking to some people within OCLC to see if there's a way to reduce or eliminate or get around that. The immediate way to get around that is to use WorldCat resource sharing instead of Iliad to process the expected really low level of lending under the new symbol, and that only costs about $100 a year. But if you're not already using WCRS, it's an additional workflow which has its own costs. The bottom line of all of this is we tried to come up with a mechanism that would enable libraries to disclose their print archiving commitments so that they and others can get the full benefit of this activity. It's the libraries that are disclosing the existing retention agreements frankly, won't get direct benefit from the fact of disclosing it. What they will get benefit from it is if everyone else does it too. So the goal is for everybody in the community to contribute what they have retained so that we can begin to reach the point where everybody is not archiving necessarily the same things, or if they are, they're doing it in a concerted, well-thought-out fashion. As you could see from the from the 583s with the condition reviews and all that, some of this can get very detailed and therefore very labor-intensive to provide. As more and more libraries start doing this, we'll have more and more operational experience that will help us to strike a balance between wanting the most detailed information about completeness and condition that we can get versus the labor-intensive nature of providing it, and how does that scale up. And finally, our feeling after working with this for more than a year was that the existing infrastructure of local holdings and 583 action notes is adequate for the near term. We encourage people to use it. We know it's not perfect, and that if it were being designed from scratch it might be done differently, but that there is enormous benefit in having a structure that libraries are already familiar with using and filling up with data, and we encourage you to go forward and do that if at all possible. And Constance and I would both be happy to answer more questions. This, at the bottom here, is the URL for the final report that's linked from the OCLC Research Hanging Together blog that Constance referenced earlier. So this note at the bottom, and I think all attendees will get access to these handouts, this note at the bottom is how to reach the final report itself. Okay, here's another question. Why don't you use the same date format in the 583 $C and D? You certainly could. That's the date the action was taken and the date it's committed for. We would recommend that you do so. They're only described there differently because the MARC definition doesn't describe them as the same. But it certainly would be better if you treated them the same. Okay, another question is, who maintains the PDA and will expand terms it recommends for use? I'm going to throw that one to Constance, I think. Sure. Constance has had a lot of conversation with the folks who maintain the PDA.
Yeah, the current PDA document is maintained by LC Network Standards. We've had ongoing conversations with them for several years now, since we've been looking at the 583 as a potential vehicle. And our intent over the course of the pilot was to use this opportunity to develop those extensions to the term list, which is already quite extensive, and initially had imagined that we would, during the course of the pilot, contribute those proposed term lists to the PDA for inclusion, that is to LC, because in effect the PDA guidance is a community document. It's not owned by anyone. It is maintained by LC, but it reflects community discussions about the development of those vocabularies. We ultimately decided that it was premature in the course of the pilot to contribute these terms before the end of the pilot, because we didn't know if we would learn anything about breakage in use of the specific terms. And I think that it was interesting. Well, sorry, I'll wrap this up because I see we have more questions. It's not immediately clear to us that all of the terms that were identified will be taken up. So in other words, the vocabulary now that is proposed is quite extensive. Some institutions, for example, the West partners, have shortened that list to be smaller. But the mechanics is, it's simply a matter of continuing to work with LC standards to get the existing PDA document updated with the term list that our working group established.
The next question is a particularly important one, I think. The question says, this seems like a lot of effort to invest in print resources that may have effectively come to the end of their useful lifespan. If libraries do not already have a plan to add LHRs, is it minimally acceptable for libraries to just use the 583 in the bib record? The short answer is yes. The longer answer is, the medium-sized answer is we would hope that people would use batch methods to at least create the committed to retain LHR, and we hope to be able to document and share some of those to the extent they're transferable from one institution to another. I think, but mostly it relates to that tension I was alluding to between recording significant details about condition for preservation purposes, condition and completeness, versus the huge level of effort it takes to invest in doing that. And I think that the decision about how much effort to invest is going to vary from library to library and program to program, but we certainly, we on the committee who recommended the guidelines certainly don't mean to imply that that level of effort needs to be done for every title, in every case. We would like the committed to retain to be provided in whatever way you can provide it. There's a couple more questions which I might run through quickly. I think question is, I think you alluded to some changes OCLC might make in the recommendations. Can you speak about what those might be? It was more the other way around, that we made some recommendations or pointed out some technical difficulties, and we don't yet have any information about what OCLC might do in response to them, although they have been very responsive in terms of wanting to be involved in the conversation about how things could be improved. The last question that I have here is, you mentioned a wish that many institutions would follow these recommendations. Do you have a sense of the critical mass necessary for you to declare success? Well, the success is the community's success. I don't think it's really, we're not looking for an OCLC success or a ad hoc coordinating committee success. We're just hoping that libraries will contribute enough that other libraries find it useful. And I'm not sure there's a way to quantify that at this point. Constance, do you?
No, I would concur with you. I think that the pilot was successful in both informing us about the degrees of difficulty of embarking in this endeavor, and also successful in having resulted in the registration, as I mentioned earlier, of print archiving commitments against a not insubstantial number of very widely held print journals. So the impact of that registration, I think, will only be felt when libraries actually take action based on the availability of that data. And you know, if one imagined the scope of West, if in fact the titles archived under West are all visible in WorldCat, it seems to me a huge achievement on the part of West, not on the part of OCLC. We've tried to make the accommodations necessary to enable registration, but it's hard to set a threshold of what critical mass would be. And I would argue that for some of these more widely held journal titles, we've hit it. We've got a lot of print archiving commitments in there for titles that many institutions would gladly establish some kind of shared responsibility for.
Thank you, Constance and Lizanne, for your insight into the bibliographic aspects of shared collections. Thank you also to all of our attendees. We hope you found today's session useful. You'll soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. Your comments are very valuable and help ALCTS to plan new continuing education offerings. I'd like to thank Mary Miller, the organizer for this online pre-conference, as well as Carrie Cassio and Alyssa Novak for providing technical support for today's webinar. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars smoothly. Information about all ALCTS webinars and continuing education events can be found on the ALCTS homepage at ala.org/ALCTS. There is one additional webinar as part of this pre-conference, tomorrow's Shared Collection Management, Planning and Communication. Another ALCTS pre-conference will be taking place June 12th through the 14th, called The How and Why of Research, What is the Rock in Your Shoe? Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you will participate in other ALCTS events in the future.